Apologies are often treated as simple words, but in relationships they carry far more weight than we realize. Many people believe that saying sorry is about admitting fault, yet beneath the surface, apologies are deeply tied to identity, emotional safety, and self-protection. This is why misunderstandings around accountability happen so often, especially between men and women. If you have ever felt confused by a lack of apology, frustrated by silence, or unsure whether accountability will ever come, this audiobook is not here to inflame resentment or assign blame. It is here to explain what is actually happening beneath the behavior. Because most of the time, what looks like avoidance is something far more complex. Understanding women's psychology around accountability requires emotional intelligence, not accusation. It requires seeing how emotion, vulnerability, and self-image interact during conflict. Once you understand these dynamics, frustration gives way to clarity, and clarity allows you to respond with strength instead of anger. This audiobook is about understanding, not judgment. Chapter 1. How Women Experience Accountability Differently. Accountability is often assumed to be a logical process. Something happens, responsibility is acknowledged, an apology is offered, and repair follows. But for many women, accountability is not processed primarily through logic. It is processed through emotion. This difference is where many misunderstandings begin. When a woman reflects on a conflict, her mind often moves inward first. She assesses how the situation made her feel, how it affected her sense of safety, and how it reflects on her identity. The internal emotional experience becomes the primary focus, not the external behavior. In this process, emotional self-validation can feel like accountability. If she understands why she reacted the way she did, if she feels emotionally justified, she may experience internal closure without feeling the need to verbalize it. From the outside, this looks like avoidance. From the inside, it feels resolved. This is not dishonesty or manipulation. It is a different psychological pathway. Many women are taught early that their emotions must be understood before anything else can be addressed. Accountability, therefore, becomes an emotional reckoning rather than a verbal admission. The problem arises when this internal process is invisible to a partner who expects external acknowledgement. Silence, reflection, or emotional distance may feel like withdrawal, but internally it may be an attempt to stabilize and protect the self. When emotional regulation takes priority, apology becomes secondary, not because responsibility is denied, but because emotional safety is being restored first. This difference does not mean accountability is absent. It means it is being processed privately rather than publicly. When this gap is not understood, frustration builds. One person waits for words, the other feels pressured while still emotionally processing. Neither feels seen. The misunderstanding deepens because both are operating from different definitions of responsibility. To understand this dynamic, it is necessary to separate intent from impact. A woman may fully recognize that something went wrong while simultaneously feeling overwhelmed by the emotional implications of admitting fault. The fear is not always about being wrong. It is about what being wrong means emotionally. Shame, loss of stability, and vulnerability can feel more threatening than the conflict itself. In these moments, self-protection often overrides communication. What feels like silence is often emotional containment. This difference in accountability styles is not a flaw. It is a psychological distinction that requires awareness. When one side expects logic and the other is navigating emotion, conflict becomes less about the issue and more about misunderstanding the process itself. This difference becomes even more pronounced inside romantic relationships. Many men interpret accountability through action and language. Saying sorry is seen as a clear signal of responsibility and repair. When that signal does not appear, the assumption is often that accountability is being avoided or denied. But for many women, verbal apology does not feel like the first step. It feels like the final step. Before words are offered, there is an internal emotional process that must feel complete. This process includes understanding her own feelings, regaining emotional balance, and protecting her sense of self from collapse. During this time, pressure to apologize can feel invasive rather than constructive. Instead of encouraging accountability, it can activate defensiveness. What the man experiences as a reasonable request for acknowledgement, the woman may experience as emotional threat. This creates a cycle where the more one side pushes for verbal ownership, the more the other retreats inward. Silence grows not because accountability is rejected, but because emotional regulation has not finished. The core misunderstanding lies in timing. One side seeks immediate repair through words, the other seeks internal safety before expression. When these timelines clash, frustration replaces empathy. Both people feel unheard. The man feels dismissed, the woman feels overwhelmed. Without understanding this difference, conversations escalate into power struggles rather than resolution. Accountability then becomes associated with pressure instead of repair. Over time, this dynamic can harden into resentment. The key insight is that silence does not always mean refusal, it often means processing. Understanding this does not require accepting harmful behavior, but it does require recognizing that emotional accountability and verbal accountability do not always occur simultaneously. When space is allowed for emotional stabilization, verbal responsibility becomes more accessible. When pressure is reduced, safety increases, and when safety increases, accountability becomes possible rather than resisted. Chapter 2. Apology versus emotional safety. An apology is often framed as a simple moral act. You did something wrong, you acknowledge it, and you say sorry. But for many women, an apology is not just an admission of behavior, it is an emotional exposure. It opens the door to vulnerability, judgment, and potential loss of safety. Before an apology can happen, emotional safety must exist. Without it, accountability feels less like repair and more like risk. When a woman senses that admitting fault will lead to criticism, dismissal, or emotional escalation, her nervous system responds defensively. Even if she intellectually understands that an apology would help the relationship, her body may register danger. Emotional safety is the foundation that determines whether accountability can surface. Without safety, self-protection takes over. This is why apologies can feel threatening rather than healing. They are not just words, they are moments where identity feels exposed. Many women are deeply aware of how quickly accountability can turn into character judgment. One mistake becomes proof of being careless, selfish, or inadequate. In that emotional context, apologizing does not feel like resolution, it feels like confirmation of a negative identity. This fear does not always come from the current relationship. It often comes from past experiences where vulnerability was punished instead of met with understanding. Emotional memory teaches caution. As a result, silence or explanation may feel safer than apology. From the outside, this looks like avoidance. Internally, it feels like self-preservation. Emotional safety is not about never being challenged. It is about knowing that mistakes will not be used as weapons. When a woman does not feel emotionally safe, her focus shifts from repair to protection. She may explain her intentions instead of acknowledging impact. She may withdraw instead of engaging.
These responses are often misinterpreted as lack of accountability, but they are better understood as attempts to reduce emotional threat. When safety is present, the opposite happens. Defenses lower, openness increases. Apologies feel possible because the risk feels manageable. Emotional safety is created through calm presence, respectful tone, and patience. When conflict is approached without accusation, accountability feels less dangerous. The paradox is that the more pressure is applied for an apology, the less safe it feels to offer one. Urgency communicates threat, not resolution. For many women, emotional safety must come before responsibility can be spoken. This does not mean accountability should be abandoned or excused. It means the pathway to accountability matters. When safety is prioritized, apology becomes a natural outcome rather than a forced concession. Understanding this dynamic shifts conflict away from power struggles and toward repair. Accountability thrives in environments where vulnerability is met with steadiness rather than judgment.
Emotional safety determines not only whether an apology happens, but how it happens. When safety is absent, accountability is often replaced by indirect behaviors. A woman may change her actions, soften her tone, or offer care without ever saying the words sorry. Internally, she may feel she has made amends. Externally, the lack of verbal acknowledgement leaves the partner feeling unresolved. This disconnect fuels resentment on both sides. The partner feels unseen, while the woman feels pressured and misunderstood. Emotional safety allows accountability to move from internal intention to external expression. When a woman feels respected during conflict, when her emotions are acknowledged rather than dismissed, her defenses relax. She becomes more willing to take responsibility without fear of humiliation or emotional loss. Safety signals that the relationship can withstand imperfection. Without that signal, apology feels like standing exposed without protection. Many women have learned that admitting fault invites escalation rather than repair. Raised voices, emotional withdrawal, or moral superiority can follow vulnerability. Over time, the nervous system associates apology with danger. Even in healthier relationships, this conditioning remains active unless consciously addressed. This is why patience matters. Allowing space for emotional regulation does not mean avoiding accountability. It means creating conditions where accountability can emerge authentically. When safety is present, apologies tend to be more sincere, more grounded, and more meaningful. They are offered not to end pressure, but to restore connection. Understanding this does not require abandoning expectations. It requires adjusting approach. Accountability cannot be forced into existence. It must be invited through emotional stability. When a woman feels safe enough to be imperfect without losing respect, apology becomes a bridge rather than a threat.
Chapter 3. Shame Avoidance and Self-Image. Shame operates very differently from guilt, and this difference is central to understanding why apologies can feel so difficult. Guilt is about behavior. It says something I did caused harm. Shame is about identity. It says something I did means something is wrong with who I am. For many women, accountability triggers shame far more quickly than guilt. The moment a mistake is acknowledged, the emotional experience shifts from correcting an action to defending the self. This is where resistance begins. When shame is activated, the nervous system moves into protection mode. Defensiveness rises, justification appears, withdrawal feels safer than exposure. An apology in this state does not feel like growth, it feels like self-destruction. This is why accountability can be delayed or avoided, not because responsibility is denied, but because the emotional cost feels too high. Shame collapses nuance. One mistake becomes a reflection of overall worth. Saying sorry does not feel like owning a moment, it feels like accepting a permanent label. This internal experience is rarely visible to a partner who may only see avoidance, but internally, the fear is not about the issue itself, it is about what the issue symbolizes. Many women have learned that being wrong leads to emotional withdrawal, rejection, or diminished value. These experiences shape how accountability is approached later in life. When shame is present, explanation often replaces apology. Explaining intent feels safer than admitting fault. It preserves self-image while still acknowledging emotional complexity. From the outside, this looks like deflection. From the inside, it feels like survival. Shame also disrupts emotional regulation. Once activated, it becomes difficult to stay present. Apology requires emotional stability, but shame destabilizes. Until the self feels safe again, responsibility remains locked behind defense. Understanding this mechanism reframes silence and resistance. It is not always refusal, it is often shame avoidance, and until shame is reduced, accountability cannot move forward.
Protecting self-image becomes the priority once shame is activated. The mind shifts from repair to preservation. Instead of focusing on the relationship, attention turns inward toward preventing emotional collapse. This is why indirect acknowledgement often replaces direct apology. A woman may express regret through behavior, emotional care, or changed patterns rather than words. Internally, this feels safer. It allows responsibility without full exposure. The problem is that indirect repair is rarely recognized as accountability by a partner who expects verbal ownership. This gap deepens misunderstanding. The partner feels dismissed, while the woman feels she has already taken responsibility in the only way that felt emotionally survivable. Shame also distorts perception. When identity feels under threat, even gentle requests for accountability can feel accusatory. Tone becomes magnified, intention is misread. What is meant as a step toward repair feels like confirmation of inadequacy. In this state, apologizing feels irreversible. Once wrong, always wrong. Once flawed, permanently flawed. This emotional absolutism makes flexibility disappear. It becomes safer to avoid apology altogether than to risk being defined by a single moment. Reducing shame changes everything. When mistakes are framed as moments rather than identities, accountability becomes possible. When errors are met with calm presence instead of moral judgment, self-image stabilizes. In that stability, apology no longer feels like self-destruction. It feels like growth. This does not mean harmful behavior should be excused. It means the pathway to accountability must consider shame sensitivity. When shame is reduced, defenses fall. When defenses fall, responsibility can be expressed openly. Understanding this dynamic allows conflict to shift from accusation to repair. It replaces pressure with clarity and transforms apology from a threat into a tool for connection. Chapter 4. The Role of Emotional Memory. Emotional memory plays a powerful role in how accountability is experienced. Unlike factual memory, which records events as sequences of actions, emotional memory records how situations felt. For many women, conflict is not stored as isolated incidents. It is stored as emotional experiences layered over time. When a disagreement happens, it does not exist on its own. It activates a network of past emotional moments that felt similar. This is why a present issue can suddenly feel heavier than it appears. The emotional weight does not come only from what just happened, but from what it reminds the body of. When accountability is requested, the nervous system does not respond only to the current situation. It responds to the accumulated emotional history associated with feeling wrong, misunderstood, or unsafe. This makes apology more complex than acknowledging a single action. It feels like reopening a file filled with unresolved emotions. Emotional memory does not operate on logic or fairness. It operates on pattern recognition.
If past attempts at accountability led to shame, dismissal, or emotional pain, the body remembers. Even if the current relationship is different, the emotional system reacts as if the past is happening again. This reaction is automatic. It happens before conscious thought. The body braces, the mind guards. Words become difficult. Silence becomes safer. From the outside, this looks disproportionate. From the inside, it feels consistent with lived experience. Emotional memory collapses time. The present moment carries echoes of the past. This is why some apologies feel impossible even when the issue seems small. The size of the reaction is not about the present conflict. It is about the emotional history being activated. Until this history is acknowledged internally, accountability feels overwhelming. Understanding this does not excuse avoidance. It explains resistance. When emotional memory is triggered, the priority becomes emotional survival rather than relational repair. Until the body feels that the present moment is truly different from the past, apology remains emotionally blocked.
Unresolved emotional history interferes with present accountability in ways that are often invisible. When past conflicts were never fully repaired, the emotional residue remains stored in the body. Each new disagreement adds another layer rather than standing alone. Over time, accountability begins to feel cumulative instead of specific. An apology no longer feels like addressing one mistake, it feels like admitting fault for an entire emotional history. This is why reactions can seem disproportionate. The nervous system is responding to more than the present moment. It is responding to every time vulnerability was met with rejection, every time explanation was dismissed, every time being wrong felt unsafe. In these moments, emotional memory overrides rational assessment. The body does not distinguish between now and then, it simply reacts. When accountability is requested, the emotional system anticipates pain based on previous experience. This anticipation creates resistance. Silence becomes a way to avoid reopening old wounds. Explanation becomes a way to control the narrative. Withdrawal becomes a way to regain stability. None of these responses are conscious strategies. They are protective reflexes shaped by emotional memory. This is why logic alone cannot resolve accountability issues rooted in emotional history. Facts do not soothe emotional memory. Safety does. The present moment must feel different enough from the past for accountability to feel possible. This difference is created through consistency, patience, and emotional steadiness over time. When a woman experiences repeated moments where vulnerability is met with respect rather than escalation, emotional memory slowly updates. The body learns that accountability no longer equals danger. In that learning, resistance softens. Apology becomes accessible not because pressure increased, but because fear decreased. Understanding emotional memory shifts the goal from winning arguments to creating safety. Accountability does not emerge from forcing the present, it emerges from healing the past enough that the present no longer feels threatening.
Chapter 5. Why Explanation Feels Like Accountability. For many women, explaining what they felt or why they reacted a certain way genuinely feels like taking responsibility. Internally, the act of explaining is not avoidance, it is reflection. It is an attempt to make sense of emotions, intentions, and internal experience. When she explains, she may feel she is offering transparency and ownership. She believes she is showing awareness by articulating what led to the behavior. From her perspective, this is accountability in action. The disconnect happens because explanation and apology serve different psychological functions. Explanation focuses on intention and emotional logic. Apology focuses on impact. When a woman explains, she is often trying to be understood before she can acknowledge harm. Understanding feels like safety. Without it, apology feels premature and risky. If her emotional experience is dismissed or misunderstood, explaining becomes a way to reclaim stability. It says, "This did not come from nowhere, it came from something real." Many women are emotionally oriented toward intention. If the intention was not to hurt, that matters deeply. Acknowledging harm without having intention recognized can feel unfair or invalidating. This is why explanation may come first or replace apology altogether. From the outside, this can sound like justification. From the inside, it feels like context. The issue is not that accountability is being rejected, it is that accountability is being processed through meaning rather than outcome. When intention feels invisible, impact feels unsafe to address. Explanation becomes a bridge to emotional security. It is an attempt to be seen as human rather than harmful. This does not mean apology is unnecessary. It means explanation often feels the necessary first step before apology can occur. When this difference is not understood, both sides feel unheard. One side waits for responsibility. One side waits for understanding, and the conflict stalls in that gap.
This disconnect becomes especially frustrating for partners who equate accountability with verbal ownership. When explanation replaces apology, it can feel like deflection or minimization. The partner hears reasons instead of responsibility and interprets that as refusal to own harm. Meanwhile, the woman feels she has already done emotional work by explaining herself and feels confused about why that is not being recognized. This mismatch creates escalation rather than resolution. The more one side pushes for an apology, the more the other doubles down on explanation. Pressure increases, defensiveness rises. The original issue becomes secondary to the fight about accountability itself. What is often missed is that explanation is not meant to erase impact. It is meant to secure emotional footing. Without that footing, apology feels unsafe. Many women fear that apologizing without being understood will reduce their entire emotional experience to wrongdoing. Explanation protects against that fear. It says, "My feelings mattered too." The problem is that explanation without impact acknowledgement leaves the partner emotionally unresolved. Both people feel invalidated in different ways. Resolution requires sequencing rather than force. When explanation is allowed without being treated as avoidance, defensiveness softens. When intention is acknowledged without excusing harm, emotional safety increases. In that safety, apology becomes more possible. Accountability then shifts from a demand to a choice. Understanding this dynamic does not require lowering standards. It requires recognizing that explanation and apology are not mutually exclusive. They simply operate in different emotional orders. When the order is respected, conflict de-escalates. When it is ignored, frustration compounds. The goal is not to choose between intention and impact, but to hold space for both. When both are acknowledged, accountability becomes collaborative rather than combative.
Chapter 6: Power, Vulnerability, and Control. Apologizing is often framed as a moral strength, but emotionally, it can feel like a loss of power. For many women, saying sorry is not just about admitting fault, it is about becoming vulnerable in a way that feels risky. Vulnerability means lowering defenses, exposing emotional soft spots, and relinquishing control over how one is perceived. In moments of conflict, this can feel dangerous rather than healing. Power, in this context, is not about dominance, it is about emotional leverage. When a woman apologizes, she may fear that she is surrendering that leverage. She may worry that admitting fault will shift the balance of the relationship in a way that leaves her exposed.
This fear is often rooted in past experiences where vulnerability was met with criticism, withdrawal, or emotional punishment. Over time, the nervous system learns that openness leads to loss. In that learning, control becomes a form of protection. Maintaining emotional distance feels safer than stepping forward into accountability. Silence, explanation, or withdrawal become tools to retain stability. Apology, by contrast, feels like stepping into uncertainty without armor. This is why accountability can feel threatening even when love is present. The fear is not always about being wrong, it is about what happens after being wrong. Will respect change? Will power shift? Will vulnerability be used against me later? When these questions linger unconsciously, control becomes the priority. Emotional distance offers a sense of safety that apology does not. This dynamic is rarely conscious. Most women do not think in terms of power. They feel it in their bodies as tension, hesitation, or resistance. The instinct is to protect the self from exposure. Until vulnerability feels safe, control will always feel more appealing than repair. Understanding this reframes avoidance not as manipulation, but as fear-driven self-preservation.
Control is often maintained not through confrontation, but through emotional distance. When vulnerability feels unsafe, withdrawing emotionally becomes a way to regain balance. Silence, minimal engagement, or shifting focus away from the conflict can restore a sense of internal control. From the outside, this behavior may look cold or dismissive. From the inside, it feels stabilizing. It allows the nervous system to calm without risking further exposure. Apologizing in this state feels like stepping forward before stability has returned. Silence feels safer than submission because it preserves autonomy. Submission, in this emotional sense, does not mean agreeing. It means surrendering emotional ground without knowing how it will be treated. Many women have learned that once ground is surrendered, it is rarely returned. This learning shapes future behavior. Accountability becomes delayed not because responsibility is denied, but because control has not yet been restored internally. Emotional distance allows time to re-establish equilibrium. Once that equilibrium exists, openness becomes possible. The problem arises when distance is misread as punishment or manipulation. In reality, it is often a pause for self-regulation. Control also appears through reframing. A woman may reinterpret events to reduce emotional threat. This is not deception, it is self-protection. By reshaping the narrative internally, she regains a sense of coherence and strength. Only from that place does vulnerability feel manageable. When control is restored, apology no longer feels like surrender. It feels like choice. This distinction matters. Apologies offered from pressure feel forced and resentful. Apologies offered from stability feel sincere. Understanding this dynamic shifts the goal from extracting accountability to creating conditions where vulnerability feels safe. When emotional leverage is not threatened, control is no longer needed. And when control is no longer needed, accountability can surface naturally without fear of loss.
Chapter 7. Relationship Dynamics and Emotional Currency. In every relationship, there is an invisible system of exchange taking place. It is not measured in words or actions alone, but in emotional contribution. Who listens more? Who adapts more? Who absorbs tension? Who carries emotional weight when things are difficult? Over time, this emotional currency is tracked unconsciously. When one person feels they have given more emotionally, accountability begins to feel uneven. An apology no longer feels like repair. It feels like an additional withdrawal from an already overdrawn account. For many women, this internal calculation happens quietly. She may feel that she has already contributed emotionally through patience, understanding, or restraint. In that context, apologizing can feel unfair rather than mature.
The thought is not, "I did nothing wrong," but "I have already given so much." This perception reduces motivation to apologize, even when responsibility exists. Emotional labor often goes unrecognized because it is invisible. Listening, accommodating, regulating mood, and holding space are rarely acknowledged as contributions. When these efforts are unseen, resentment builds. Resentment does not always express itself outwardly. It often shows up as emotional withdrawal or resistance to accountability. The woman may feel emotionally depleted and unwilling to give more through apology. From the partner's perspective, the lack of apology feels like disregard. From her perspective, it feels like self-preservation. Emotional currency also affects how conflict is interpreted. When someone believes they have invested more emotionally, they may feel entitled to understanding rather than accountability. Apology feels like imbalance correction in the wrong direction. This does not mean accountability is wrong. It means the emotional ledger feels skewed. Until emotional contributions are recognized, apology feels like additional loss rather than mutual repair. Understanding this dynamic shifts conflict from right and wrong to balance and recognition. When emotional labor is acknowledged, resistance softens. Accountability becomes less threatening because the emotional exchange feels fair again.
Resentment accumulates quietly when emotional labor feels unseen. It does not announce itself loudly or immediately. It settles beneath the surface and shapes reactions long before words are spoken. When a woman feels that her emotional contributions are taken for granted, her willingness to offer more decreases. Apology, in this context, is not experienced as a simple act of responsibility. It feels like giving again without receiving. This is why accountability can stall even when understanding exists. The resistance is not about denial, it is about depletion. Emotional exhaustion reduces generosity. When energy is low, the nervous system prioritizes conservation over repair. Apology requires emotional output. If reserves feel empty, that output feels impossible. This is especially true when past apologies were not met with change, appreciation, or reciprocity. Over time, the emotional system learns that accountability does not restore balance, it drains it further. In those conditions, silence feels protective. Accountability also becomes blocked when resentment is unspoken. Without acknowledging emotional imbalance, conflict focuses on isolated incidents while ignoring the larger pattern. The woman may feel blamed for a moment while her ongoing contributions remain invisible. This intensifies resistance. Apology feels disconnected from the real issue. Recognition becomes more important than repair. When emotional labor is named and validated, something shifts. The emotional account feels less overdrawn. Openness returns. Accountability becomes possible because it no longer feels like surrendering the last remaining resources. Understanding emotional currency does not mean excusing avoidance. It means addressing the underlying imbalance that fuels it. When both sides feel emotionally seen, apology regains its purpose as connection rather than loss.
Chapter 8. Conflict-style differences between men and women. Conflict is not only about what is being discussed, it is about how each person is wired to move through tension. Many men are oriented toward resolution. When a problem appears, the instinct is to address it, fix it, and move forward. Accountability is part of this process. Acknowledgement leads to closure. For many women, conflict is oriented toward emotional processing rather than immediate resolution. The instinct is to understand what is being felt before deciding what to do about it. These different styles often collide during moments that require apology. When accountability is requested quickly, it can feel premature to someone who is still emotionally processing.
From her perspective, the emotional experience has not settled enough for words to feel authentic. From his perspective, delay feels like avoidance. This timing mismatch creates tension. Pressure for resolution increases resistance rather than cooperation. The more urgency is applied, the more emotionally unsafe the situation feels. Women often need space to regulate emotions before they can speak clearly. That space is not rejection, it is preparation. Without it, apology feels forced and inauthentic. Men may interpret this space as withdrawal or lack of care. Women may interpret pressure as emotional invasion. Neither interpretation reflects intent, but both shape reaction. Conflict escalates because each person is responding to a different internal timeline. Accountability becomes blocked not by refusal, but by misalignment. Understanding these differences reframes delay as process rather than defiance. When space is respected, emotional clarity emerges. When clarity emerges, accountability becomes possible. Resolution cannot be rushed without consequence. Emotional processing is not inefficiency, it is how stability is restored. When conflict styles are understood, timing becomes a tool rather than a weapon. Apology offered after processing carries more sincerity than apology extracted through pressure. Recognizing these differences allows both sides to move toward repair without forcing alignment prematurely.
Pressure is one of the fastest ways to increase resistance during conflict. When a woman feels rushed to apologize before her emotional system has settled, her defenses rise. What may feel like a reasonable request for closure to one person feels like emotional intrusion to the other. The nervous system reacts to pressure as threat. Threat narrows flexibility. Words become harder to access. Silence becomes protective. This is why pursuit often backfires. The more one person pushes for resolution, the more the other retreats to regain emotional control. Space and pursuit are opposite responses that feed each other. When space is interpreted as rejection, pursuit intensifies. When pursuit intensifies, the need for space grows stronger. Accountability gets trapped between these opposing reactions. Understanding this pattern shifts the goal. Instead of pushing for apology, creating space allows emotional processing to complete. This does not mean avoiding the issue indefinitely. It means respecting the timing required for genuine accountability. Once emotional regulation returns, willingness to repair increases. Apology offered from calm is more meaningful than apology offered under pressure. When space is granted without punishment, trust grows. That trust reduces the fear associated with vulnerability. In that environment, accountability becomes less threatening and more natural. Conflict styles are not right or wrong. They are different strategies for restoring balance. When those differences are honored, apology becomes a shared outcome rather than a contested demand.
Chapter 9. The Fear of Being Wrong Forever. For many women, apologizing carries a fear that goes far beyond the moment itself. It is not just about admitting a mistake. It is about the fear of being permanently defined by that mistake. Saying sorry can feel like placing a permanent mark on one's identity. Once wrong, always wrong. Once flawed, forever flawed. This emotional absolutism makes accountability feel dangerous. The concern is not that the mistake exists, it is that the mistake will never be forgotten, never released, and never separated from who she is. This fear often develops from experiences where past mistakes were repeatedly referenced, held against her, or used as leverage in future conflicts. Over time, the emotional system learns that being wrong does not end with repair. It lingers, it resurfaces, it becomes ammunition.
In that environment, apologizing feels like giving someone a permanent weapon. Accountability then becomes something to avoid rather than embrace. This fear is rarely conscious. It shows up as hesitation, defensiveness, or silence. Internally, the thought is not, "I do not want to take responsibility." It is, "I do not want to be trapped by this moment forever." Emotional memory reinforces this fear. If previous apologies did not lead to closure, but instead reopened wounds later, the nervous system learns caution. Flexibility disappears under perceived threat. The mind becomes rigid. Apology feels irreversible. In that rigidity, resistance grows. Understanding this fear reframes avoidance as protection rather than defiance. Accountability becomes possible when mistakes are allowed to remain moments rather than identities. When repair truly leads to closure, the fear of being wrong forever begins to dissolve.
When the fear of being wrong forever is active, reassurance becomes more important than logic. The nervous system needs to know that accountability will not result in permanent judgment. Without that reassurance, flexibility shuts down. A woman may become emotionally rigid, not because she believes she is right, but because admitting wrong feels irreversible. In this state, apology feels like a trap rather than a bridge. The mind searches for certainty and control, and silence offers both. Silence avoids labeling. Silence avoids finality. Silence preserves the possibility of being understood later rather than condemned now. This is why reassurance changes accountability behavior so dramatically. When it is clear that mistakes will not be stored, weaponized, or replayed, emotional threat decreases. When repair is followed by genuine closure rather than lingering resentment, trust grows. Over time, the emotional system learns that being wrong does not equal being unsafe. Flexibility returns. Accountability no longer feels like surrender, it feels like resolution. Without reassurance, however, apology feels dangerous because the emotional cost seems permanent. This is why some women resist apologizing even when they intellectually understand responsibility. The fear is not the apology itself, it is what comes after. Understanding this shifts conflict away from extracting admissions and toward creating conditions where closure is real. When being wrong is allowed to be temporary rather than defining, accountability becomes possible. The moment apology leads to release instead of record-keeping, resistance fades.
Chapter 10. When apologies feel unnecessary. There are moments when a woman genuinely feels that an apology is not required, even though conflict exists. This does not always come from denial or lack of care. Often it comes from a different internal sense of closure. Many women process emotional situations internally and reach a point where they feel resolved without needing verbal repair. From the outside, this looks like avoidance. From the inside, it feels complete. Emotional resolution happens when feelings have been understood, regulated, and released internally. Once that internal process is finished, the situation no longer feels active. Because of this, an apology may feel redundant rather than meaningful. The assumption is that if the emotional storm has passed internally, the relationship has also moved forward. This creates a disconnect when a partner still feels unresolved. The woman feels finished, the partner feels ignored. The difference lies in how closure is defined. For many women, closure is emotional completion. For many men, closure is relational completion. Emotional completion means the feelings no longer carry weight internally. Relational completion means the issue has been acknowledged and repaired between two people. When these definitions do not align, apology feels unnecessary on one side and essential on the other. Internal justification often replaces external acknowledgement in this dynamic. The woman may feel she understands why the conflict happened and why her response made sense emotionally. That understanding becomes self-validation.
From her perspective, responsibility has already been taken internally. The issue is no longer emotionally alive, so revisiting it feels disruptive rather than helpful. Apology, in this context, feels like reopening something that has already been settled. This is not indifference, it is a difference in how resolution is experienced. Without recognizing this distinction, both sides feel frustrated. One feels pressured to apologize for something that no longer feels relevant, the other feels dismissed because verbal repair never occurred. Understanding this gap is essential to resolving why apologies sometimes feel unnecessary rather than withheld.
The tension deepens when emotional completion is mistaken for relational completion. When a woman feels internally resolved, she may believe the relationship has naturally moved forward. There is no lingering emotional charge inside her, so the issue feels closed. From the partner's perspective, however, nothing has been repaired because the emotional impact was never acknowledged aloud. This creates a sense of unfinished business. The partner may continue carrying hurt or confusion, while the woman feels surprised that the issue is still alive. This mismatch often leads to repeated conflict about the same situation. The woman may feel accused of dragging things backward. The partner may feel ignored or invalidated. Neither experience is wrong. They are operating from different definitions of resolution. Emotional completion happens privately. Relational completion happens jointly. When these two are not aligned, apology becomes the missing bridge. From the woman's perspective, that bridge feels unnecessary because she has already crossed it internally. From the partner's perspective, the bridge was never built. This is why conversations about apology can feel circular. One person is asking for something that feels essential. The other is being asked to revisit something that feels complete. Without understanding this difference, frustration escalates into resentment. Accountability becomes associated with rehashing rather than healing. The key insight is that internal resolution does not automatically repair relational wounds. A relationship requires shared acknowledgement to restore trust. When this distinction is understood, apology no longer feels pointless. It becomes a tool for aligning internal closure with external connection. Accountability is not about reopening the wound, it is about closing it together.
Chapter 11. What actually encourages accountability? Accountability rarely emerges from pressure, confrontation, or repeated demands. In fact, those approaches often produce the opposite effect. What truly encourages accountability is emotional safety combined with calm clarity. When a woman feels respected rather than cornered, her defenses lower. The nervous system shifts out of protection mode and into openness. This shift is subtle but powerful. Accountability does not arise when someone feels judged. It arises when someone feels seen. Calm presence communicates stability. It signals that the relationship can withstand imperfection. When emotions are met without escalation, the body relaxes enough to reflect honestly. In this environment, responsibility feels possible rather than threatening. Respectful listening matters more than persuasive arguments. When a woman feels heard emotionally, she becomes more willing to hear the impact of her actions. Validation does not mean agreement, it means acknowledging emotional reality. This acknowledgement creates trust. Trust reduces fear. Reduced fear opens the door to accountability. Another key condition is timing. Accountability cannot be rushed. Emotional processing must complete before responsibility can be expressed sincerely. Giving space is not avoidance when it is paired with reassurance. Space communicates patience rather than abandonment. It allows internal regulation to occur without pressure.
When space is granted without punishment or withdrawal of affection, emotional defenses soften. Accountability grows in environments where mistakes are treated as moments rather than character flaws. When wrongdoing is addressed without moral superiority, apology feels like repair instead of humiliation. Encouraging accountability is less about demanding words and more about creating conditions where vulnerability feels safe. When safety exists, responsibility follows naturally.
Safety, respect, and timing work together to unlock accountability. When respect is consistent, a woman does not feel the need to protect her self-image at all costs. She knows that admitting fault will not diminish her value in the relationship. This assurance changes everything. Accountability becomes an act of strength rather than a risk. Timing also plays a critical role. When accountability is invited after emotional regulation, it feels accessible. When it is demanded during emotional overload, it feels impossible. Understanding this distinction prevents unnecessary escalation. Calm curiosity invites reflection. Accusation invites defense. The difference is not subtle to the nervous system. One feels like an opening, the other feels like a threat. Accountability also increases when responsibility is separated from punishment. When apologies are met with closure instead of record-keeping, trust builds. A woman becomes more willing to acknowledge mistakes when she knows they will not be used later as leverage. This creates a feedback loop where openness is rewarded with safety. Over time, this pattern reshapes emotional memory. Accountability no longer triggers fear, it triggers repair. Encouragement replaces pressure. Understanding replaces control. This is how responsibility becomes sustainable rather than resisted. Accountability thrives in environments where vulnerability is protected, mistakes are allowed to be human, and repair leads to peace rather than prolonged tension. Chapter 12. Understanding without resentment. Understanding women's psychology around accountability is not about excusing behavior or lowering standards. It is about removing resentment from the equation so clarity can take its place. Resentment grows when actions are misunderstood and intentions are misread. When accountability is expected but not delivered in the way anticipated, frustration hardens into bitterness. Understanding dissolves that bitterness by revealing the emotional mechanics underneath behavior. When you understand why apology feels difficult, silence stops feeling personal. It becomes contextual. This does not mean you accept what hurts you. It means you respond with awareness instead of anger. Resentment thrives in confusion. Clarity weakens it. When behavior is interpreted through psychology rather than assumption, emotional reactivity decreases. You stop chasing validation. You stop demanding words as proof of worth. Instead, you assess behavior patterns, emotional consistency, and willingness to repair over time. Understanding gives you emotional leverage without control. It allows you to stay grounded even when accountability is delayed or imperfect. This grounded perspective protects you from internalizing someone else's emotional process as a reflection of your value. Resentment also fades when expectations are realistic. Expecting immediate accountability from someone still emotionally processing sets both people up for failure. Understanding does not mean waiting forever. It means choosing when to engage and when to step back. It allows you to hold boundaries without hostility. Understanding creates emotional maturity. It shifts focus from forcing behavior to observing patterns. In that observation, you gain clarity about what you can work with and what you cannot. Resentment loses its grip when you stop taking emotional delays personally and start evaluating reality calmly. Understanding without resentment also means knowing when to stop pursuing accountability. Not every situation will resolve through apology.
Sometimes the absence of accountability is information rather than a challenge. Chasing apologies can keep you emotionally stuck, tethered to someone else's readiness rather than your own well-being. Emotional maturity involves recognizing when understanding is enough and when behavior no longer aligns with your values. Responding without chasing means choosing peace over control. It means allowing people to be where they are without making their limitations your responsibility. This does not mean tolerating disrespect. It means making clear decisions based on patterns rather than promises. When accountability is consistently avoided, despite safety, respect, and clarity, understanding becomes a signal to step back. Walking away emotionally sometimes is the healthiest response. Understanding empowers choice. It allows you to engage without illusion and disengage without bitterness. The goal is not to win accountability. The goal is to remain grounded, self-respecting, and emotionally intact. When you understand without resentment, you free yourself from needing closure from someone else. You create it within yourself.
Understanding accountability in relationships is not about assigning blame or proving who is right. It is about seeing clearly enough to respond with strength instead of frustration. Throughout this audiobook, you have explored the emotional mechanics that shape why apologies can feel difficult, delayed, or absent. This understanding is not meant to excuse harmful behavior or lower your standards. It is meant to remove confusion so resentment does not take root. When you understand the difference between emotional processing and avoidance, between protection and denial, you stop taking silence personally. You stop chasing words as validation. Instead, you observe patterns, timing, and consistency. You learn when patience is wise and when distance is necessary. Emotional intelligence does not mean tolerating what hurts you. It means choosing responses that protect your peace. Some relationships will deepen through understanding. Others will reveal their limits. Both outcomes offer clarity. Accountability cannot be forced, but boundaries can be chosen. When you stop seeking closure from others and start grounding it within yourself, you reclaim control over your emotional life. Understanding is not weakness, it is freedom.
Understanding accountability in relationships is not about forcing apologies or proving who is right. It is about seeing clearly enough to protect your peace without resentment. Throughout this audiobook, you have explored the emotional forces that shape why apologies can feel delayed, avoided, or impossible. This understanding is not meant to excuse behavior or lower your standards. It is meant to remove confusion so bitterness does not take hold. When you understand the difference between emotional processing and avoidance, you stop personalizing silence. You stop chasing words for validation. Instead, you observe patterns, consistency, and emotional maturity over time. Some relationships will deepen through this clarity. Others will reveal their limits. Both outcomes give you power. Accountability cannot be forced, but boundaries can be chosen. When you stop waiting for closure from others and begin grounding it within yourself, you reclaim control over your emotional life. Understanding is not weakness, it is freedom.